My name is Charmaine, and I live in one of the biggest cities in Texas. I have lived here for most of my life, but I was born in New Orleans. I had a wonderful childhood, and as I got older, I became very spiritual. My parents have different religious backgrounds. My mother was raised Catholic, and my father is a Baptist. Since I believe in God, I also believe that his opposite is very real, and those who are sensitive are vulnerable to his attacks, even while sleeping. I know that I may get a few eye rolls over this, but these are my beliefs, and I feel they play a big role in this story. Just hear me out. You can come to your own conclusions about what happened, but I'm going to share 2 experiences that have frightened me the most. The first experience started off with me heading to bed early because of a long day I had at work. I can't remember if I fell asleep right away or if it took me some time to drift off. My eyes suddenly flicked open, and I found myself unable to move. I was lying on my stomach, and the room was very dark. I don't say my room, because it felt as though I was in a completely different setting. I could see a wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room, with a strange light surrounding it. The next thing I knew, I felt something crawling on my back, something that had claws. I tried to move, but of course, I was still immobilized. Whatever was on my back leaned down to my ear and began to speak. I don't know what was being said, because it was in a language I didn't recognize. I desperately struggled and cried out, and immediately, I woke up. I've had nightmares before, but I've never had anything speak to me like that. After that night, I made it a point never to fall asleep on my stomach again, and I still don't to this day. A few nights later, I fell asleep on my back, and once again woke up, unable to move. I could feel my arms pinned to my sides. Then something grabbed my shirt and began pulling me off the bed. I swear, all of this felt real. Imagine just waking up, paralyzed, and something literally drags you out of your bed. I started to panic and regained a limited movement. I don't know where I was being pulled to. I tried grabbing the sheets and bed frame in a desperate attempt to save myself, but whatever had a hold of me was much stronger than I. I tried calling out again, but couldn't. It was like there was sand clogging my throat. I was dragged from the bed into complete darkness. That's when I heard a cacophony of tortured wails and agonized screaming. It's what I imagine hell sounds like. When I finally woke up, to say that I was frightened would be an understatement. I called my pastor about it the next day. He suggested that dark forces prey on us when we're at our weakest, and that we should trust in the Lord's protection and pray for his guidance. I haven't experienced anything like that since, and I'm hoping I never do. I pray every night before I go to bed, and I feel comforted by my faith. Even if you're a person of practicality, I still hope you can appreciate this experience from a purely psychological perspective. Rather it be a severe case of sleep paralysis or a demonic encounter, it was still, nevertheless, absolutely terrifying. Have you ever had a dream so surreal, you could almost swear it was real, where all the events, people, and details are so accurate that it seems like you were transported into an alternate reality? Well, that's how it felt like for me at least. To clear up any confusion, this dream takes place when I was a teenager. I'm in my early 20s now, and I grew up as a Boy Scout. I was no stranger to the outdoors and camping, Although I never made Eagle, I'll never forget all the good times and lessons I learned as a scout. My dream begins with me waking up in a recreational room with a series of finger paintings on the table. What the paintings depicted was disturbing. It showed children walking into a forested area. Then they were laying on the ground, in pieces. Feeling uneasy, I walked out to the mess hall. The walls of the building were tinted in an eerie blue, and no one else was around. I stepped outside to see if I could find anyone. The sky was a gloomy blue abyss, with flashes of lightning arcing across it. The sun was completely blocked out. As I made my way down the trail that led up to the campsite, I heard what sounded like someone striking an anvil to my right. I looked, but saw nothing. I then heard my father's voice. "Hey Tim, do you mind picking up the pace?" I then shouted, "Dad? Where are you?" I looked around trying to find my father, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Now I was on edge. I stood perfectly still, listening for any footsteps or rustling around me. The same noise suddenly erupted, as if it was directly next to my ear. I whipped around so quickly, I almost tripped on my own feet. There was nothing. I then realized that my dad must have headed up the trail without me. I began running, trying to catch up to him and get the hell away from whatever was making that metallic strike. But as I was about to set off, something snagged my foot and I fell to the ground, and then began being pulled toward the forest. Before I could attempt to free myself, I felt something constricting around my neck, covering my eyes. I screamed as thick, green vines ensnared my entire body, and sharp thorns dug into my eyes. I started thrashing around on the ground, trying desperately to get away, only for the vines to squeeze tighter and tighter. The forest had come to life. The finger paintings were trying to warn me, but now it was too late. I was certain that this was how I would die. I was then jolted awake, with blurry eyes and my heart racing. After calming down and rubbing my eyes, I felt the biggest headache consuming my entire skull, and my vision was still blurred. I looked at my hands, and it was only then that I realized the painful thorns in my nightmares were my own fingers digging into my closed eyes. Thankfully, I did not damage my eyesight, and I still enjoy the outdoors, and will likely be camping sometime in the near future. But if you ask me what my fears are, one of my biggest is being blinded by sharp objects. I'll never forget that night terror for as long as I live, where my own subconscious attacked me. This happened to me during the pandemic, but my sleep schedule was all over the place. I have had many strange dreams throughout my life, but the one we'll be talking about today is something that I will never forget or will ever be able to explain completely, but I'll give it my best shot. Just remember that dreams operate on their own terms. Things began with me walking to my school's locker room. I was going there to meet up with my friend Sam to play soccer. When I arrived, there were lots of people there I hadn't seen before. Sam was there, and for some reason his cousin Simon, who I hadn't seen in over a year, was also there, waiting for me. The three of us went outside and kicked around the soccer ball under a gray, gloomy sky. I could hear what can only be described as an organ playing somewhere in the distance. A series of tornadoes touched down and began to ravage the surrounding landscapes. They were not close enough to be an immediate threat, but close enough to be concerning. None of us, including myself, seemed to be alarmed by their presence. I remember saying, in a very calm manner, "Should we leave?" Sam replied, "No, don't worry. They are only here to clean up. I have no clue what Sam was talking about, and since this was a dream, I didn't have the common sense to question him on what exactly he meant by that. We then were suddenly all sitting on chairs in a circle in a dimly lit room somewhere inside the school. Sam and Simon were next to me, but there were others as well. A faint howling of the wind could be heard outside. I looked up at a digital clock that was mounted to the wall and noticed it said 3 a.m. Suddenly I had this really uneasy feeling, like something bad was going to happen. I looked to my left and noticed a kid who was no older than 12. He looked severely out of place, wearing a pair of jeans and a black leather jacket, as the rest of us were wearing our school's uniforms, polo shirts with khaki trousers. He was talking to somebody on his left. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the kid was becoming very upset as the conversation continued, becoming visibly distressed and crying, which soon became insane laughter. The intercom system sounded off.
"Bear witness, children. His mind is breaking. You will have to return. The rest of you must continue this journey."
There was a man in the corner of the room who looked like he could be the boy's father. The kid had fallen off his chair because of how much he was laughing. The man stood there with his arms crossed and head tilted down, looking at the boy with a very angry expression. The ominous voice spoke again.
"Oh, you must not blame him. He is simply not designed for this place."
The boy started laughing even harder and pointing at his father. The man walked out of the room through a pair of double doors. Soon, 2 men in black jumpsuits appeared in the doorway. They were wearing porcelain masks that were fixed in a surprised expression.
That is why we have this process, to weed out the filth.
The masked men handed out more of the porcelain masks to the other students, all except for me. Everyone else in the room, including Sam and Simon, put on their masks simultaneously and began conversing in this language that was unfamiliar to me. As this was happening, the kid in the leather jacket kept trying to get up, but fell to the floor with laughter. This went on for another 30 seconds, until the man stormed back into the room, which caused everyone at the exact same time to stop speaking and turn their heads to face him. The man walked straight over to the kid in the leather jacket and went absolutely berserk on him, getting angrier and angrier the more he screamed. His face became as red as a tomato. No one else in the room made a sound or movement. They just stared on through the holes in their masks. The man then pulled out a gun and started shooting all around the room. Everyone in the room let out the most terrifying cries, but did not remove their masks or stand up from their chairs. I had seen enough and got up and ran through the double doors and down the hallway. The intercom system sounded off again.
"Yes, very good. Cleanse the filth. Cleanse the filth. Cleanse the filth."
I continued running down the hallway until the gunshots faded into the distance. I had no reservations about leaving Simon and Sam behind. I found myself before a train station, which was just across the street from the school. One of the tornadoes was now zigzagging toward the station. I could hear the intercom voice say something behind me.
"Better hurry and run along."
When I entered the station, it looked much different than it usually does. It resembled a supermarket. There were rows of shelves, and at the end of each row was a moving train car. I ran down a random aisle and hopped onto the train. There was only one other person in this train car. It was my friend Robert. He sat wearing his school uniform. "Robert, where is this train going?" I asked frantically. Robert slowly looked out the window. "Nowhere." I turned to see what he was looking at. The tornado was now coming directly toward the train. I felt us being lifted off the ground and flung into the air. The last thing I remember was seeing the ground become very far away and hearing the howling wind. I woke up in a cold sweat, literally falling off my bed. Later on that morning, when the sun came out, I texted my friend Robert and asked him if he wanted to hang out that day. He said sure, and that we should meet up at the soccer field outside of our school. When I rendezvoused with him, I told him about the dream I had, from start to finish. "Wow, that sounds like some fever dream shit. Hey look, who's that over there?" That's when we saw Sam on the other side of the soccer field, kicking around a ball with, you guessed it, Simon. As soon as we saw them, we heard the unmistakable sounds of our town's tornado sirens. Those who dream by day are cognizant of many things that escape those who dream only at night. Edgar Allan Poe. Go to bed and wait for the Sandman. Even as it came out of James' mouth, it seemed like a strange thing to say, and he wasn't sure why he had, but for some reason it worked. Daniel went to bed. The next morning, though, James was making breakfast. Daniel sat at the table, two short legs swinging under his chair. He asked, "What does a Sandman look like?" Nothing really. It's just an expression." "What does it mean, though?" "It's just something people say." He put a plate of eggs in front of Daniel and kissed him on top of his head. He thought that would be the end of it, until he saw the Sandman for himself. He was getting ready for bed and stopped by Daniel's room to check on him while he slept, as he often did. It was such a routine precaution that when he saw a pale, naked man sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed, rocking back and forth, it took a moment for him to process what he was seeing. He reacted the way any father would, of course. He ran into the room screaming, and for a moment, he thought about attacking the intruder. But then the man on the bed turned, and that's when James saw it really wasn't a man. It was a pale, slithery thing, hairless and warped. Its joints turned the wrong way, and its body was out of shape with itself. When it moved, it was like an insane marionette dancing on stage. James froze. The skittering thing watched him, and he felt spreading warmth. And that's when he realized he had pissed his pants. It was only when he remembered that Daniel was still there in bed, staring at the broken-shaped thing, sitting just a foot away, that he regained the courage to move again. He grabbed Daniel and ran. In the hall, he turned to see if the thing would follow him, but it didn't. For a moment it watched, and then, moving like a stop-motion nightmare, it crawled to the window and jumped out, leaving only the billowing curtains to mark its passing. James had trouble explaining everything to the police. He reported a break-in, but when asked to describe the intruder, he didn't know what to say. How could he make the ordinary man in the blue uniform, sitting at his kitchen table with two of his colleagues searching the house, understand a thing like he had seen? He couldn't even understand it himself. To make things worse, Daniel's memory did not correspond with his own. He described an ordinary-looking burglar, a man in a mask. James thought about it. Had it been a mask? No. It would have had to have been a full costume, and an elaborate one at that, something like they would use for a movie, and that also wouldn't explain the way it moved. But in the end, he simply echoed his son's testimony. A man in a mask. A burglar. The lie unsettled him almost as much as what had happened. The doctors said Daniel wasn't hurt and showed no signs of molestation. James was relieved about that. They stayed at a motel for a couple of nights until they felt ready to head back home. And then James had a new security system installed, along with bars on the windows. He didn't like the sight of them in Daniel's room, but it seemed like the only thing to do. James was frightened the first night back in the house, but strangely, Daniel wasn't. When asked if he felt okay sleeping alone, he just said yes. In the end, it was James who found himself wishing that he were not sleeping alone. He was up all night listening for the sound of anything moving in the house. Although he had convinced himself that his memory was faulty and that it had been a normal, albeit probably deeply disturbed, man in his son's room that night. But when he closed his eyes even for a moment, he pictured bloodless skin and a twisted, inhuman face. He found himself wondering, why my house? Why my family? He knew, of course, that there didn't have to be a reason. But still, he wondered. 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped talking. James didn't notice at first. Kids went through quiet phases sometimes. But eventually, he tried to get Daniel to talk, and he wouldn't. Eventually, it became clear he couldn't. Back to the doctor they went. Nothing wrong with him that we can see, was the diagnosis. Could it be trauma? Could be. Sometimes these things come in late. Children can be a mystery even to those who know them best. I recommend a child psychologist. James couldn't afford that. He couldn't even afford the bill that they were giving him now. Nothing seemed to help. Daniel would write out answers to his questions sometimes, but never more than a yes or no. James would ask him what was wrong, or if he had seen or heard anything that frightened him. Daniel would only stare. He seemed furtive and bemused. James found himself missing the sound of his son's voice. Sometimes he wanted to hear it so bad that he ached. But it seemed that Daniel would not talk again until he was ready. James had other things to worry about too. He was convinced, beyond reason, that the intruder never left. The alarm never went off and all the locks and doors remained undisturbed, but he was sure that he heard a movement in the night. Not the normal kind of movement either. It sounded like a huge snake slithering through the house. When he heard it, he imagined horrible things. Nothing was ever there when he went to investigate, though he often thought he saw a glimpse of something just out of the corner of his eye. A pale foot or a misshapen shadow that would slink away as soon as he turned. He rarely slept, and when he did, he had haunted dreams. Soon he realized that he had not left the house in weeks, except to go to the bank and buy groceries. He felt hemmed in. With Daniel acting mute, he hadn't had an actual conversation with anyone in weeks. So he called his mother. The connection was bad, and her voice sounded faint, on the verge of not being there at all. I guess I'm okay, Mom. He paused to wipe the sweat from his palms and to make sure that he could hear Danny playing in the next room. But things have been a bit rough. We had a break-in.
Oh, how awful. Did they take anything?
No, they just ran off. It was weird though. Haven't really felt comfortable since then.
Are you still working at the hospital?
No, Mom. I left last year. You know that.
Oh, well. Have you been getting out? What about that nice woman you were seeing last year? The one who played the piano?
James scowled. She was always asking that kind of thing. Didn't she know how hard it was being a single father, and that he didn't have the time? He was about to say so, when something made him pause. Ma, is there someone else on the line?
I don't think so.
James was sure he heard it. A short, gasping sound of someone trying to hold their breath, but failing. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. You're sure nobody is listening on your other phone?
Dear, there is no other phone. I'm on the cell. That's why the service is so bad.
Then what is... James stopped. If the sound wasn't coming from her end, then... He dropped the phone and raced to the hall. The extension hung on its hook, undisturbed. Heart pounding, he hurtled into the garage. The spare phone sat on the workbench. No one was in sight. But could they have been? Could someone have been here all along, listening in on his call, and then slithered away? Might they still be here even now? The next day, James took out all the phone extensions and even patched the holes with rubber cement. Daniel watched him work with curious eyes, but James offered no explanation. He began giving Daniel a light physical exam every week. His CNA training was a little rusty after a year on disability, but you never truly forget. It was an absurd thing to do, of course. Even if there was a physical cause for Daniel's behavior, it would be nothing he could discover this way. He was aware on some level that this was compulsive behavior. Nevertheless, it made him feel better. One morning, James set the diaphragm of the stethoscope against Daniel's chest, but he could not locate a heartbeat. He moved his hand, searching for the right spot, but to no avail. Then, to test it, he listened to his own heartbeat. It came through, steady and clear. But when he checked Daniel again, he couldn't hear anything. A thought came unbidden to him of the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, whose chest was as empty as a kettle. A sick feeling roiled in his stomach. He threw the stethoscope down and grabbed Danny by the shoulders, looking into his face. Daniel stared back with bright eyes. He even smiled a little, with the corners of his mouth. James felt the tingle of tears. He swept his son up in his arms and hugged him, and Daniel hugged him back. Then James put his shirt back on him and sent him to go play. The stethoscope, he decided, was broken. He threw it in the trash. Things got worse. James' terrors were no longer relegated to the long hours of the night. Now it seemed that some creeping, some skittering and scuttling, some unknowable noise in some dark corner or another filled every second of his day. The thought of how big the house really was started to weigh on him. There were so many rooms he wasn't in at any given time, so many places someone or something else could be in. He imagined strange figures occupying the rest of his home when he wasn't around, melting into the walls or merging with the shadows whenever he turned on a light or opened a door. How would he know if they were there? How would he ever know? Soon he didn't even have to be outside of a room to imagine it. When he walked up the stairs, he pictured a pale figure lurking beneath them. When he went down the hall, he pictured a crawling thing slithering behind the walls, shadowing his every step. If he sat too long in the same chair, he imagined it was right behind him. And he was never comforted when he turned around and saw nothing there. As he could only guess, that meant it had moved, swiftly and silently, behind him once again. Wherever he was not looking right now, That was where he imagined it would be. He was losing his mind. He knew it. The only thing that helped him cling on to sanity was that Daniel seemed undisturbed. Other than his muteness, his behavior was perfectly normal, and whenever he seemed to sense his father was troubled, he would hug him, or squeeze his hand, or even smile. Sometimes, when he left the room, James cried. One night he found himself creeping around the house with no lights on at 2 o'clock in the morning. If the intruding thing had taken to violating his daytime activities, then he would get revenge by confronting it on its own terms, the night. And really, night was no more frightening to him now than day. They were almost interchangeable. He walked barefoot down the halls, up the stairs, in and out of disused rooms. Sometimes he even stopped to listen, hoping to locate it by sound. It was a stealthy, creeping thing, he knew. But it was awkward at times, and it couldn't always keep its strangely shaped limbs from making their distinct, irregular footsteps. The smallest noise would give it away. There was one room he suspected it spent most of its time in, the spare bedroom. Not a bedroom at all, really. More like a closet that was just big enough to accommodate a bed, if one were so inclined. It was unpainted, uncarpeted, and drafty. He had always meant to fix it up. He didn't come here often because he disliked the bare, unused look of it. It made him think of a partially dissected corpse. He came in now, though. If the thing had made its nest in any one place in the house, this would be it. Of course, there was nothing there now, but that didn't mean there was nothing there. He cursed, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. What was he missing? How did it hide from him? What was its secret? He peered into the room's empty corners one by one, getting his face a few inches from the plaster and floorboards so that he could be certain that there was no space for it to conceal itself. The light bulb flickered. He froze. My God, it's on the ceiling. He pictured it, crawling above him like a huge, pale lizard. That's how it gets around. That's how it escapes every time I should have it cornered. It just scuttles up the wall and hides right above my head. He imagined it dangled down behind him like a spider. If I turn around, it'll be there, hanging with its face right next to mine. He held his breath. He didn't want to turn around, but he had no choice. It was between him and the door. With a quiet sob, he rounded on his heels. Of course, he was alone. There wasn't anything on the ceiling. He checked twice. Maybe it crawled out and was waiting for him out in the hall. But when he checked there, the coast was once again clear. It should have been a relief. But it was not. After all, it had to be here somewhere. If the ceiling was not its trick, that just meant it was something else. Something even more strange, even more clever. He went to Daniel's room. He had not stopped checking on him all night, like he always had. This time, though, rather than opening the door, he listened first, pressing his ear against the grain of the cheap wood and holding his breath, terrified he would hear a skittering sound on the other side of the barrier. But what he heard instead shocked him even more. Daniel was talking to someone. James recoiled for a second, and then, when he caught his breath, he all but kicked the door in. Daniel was already awake, indeed, sitting up in bed, but he was not saying anything now. A light flashed on, and James stalked halfway into the room before stopping, suddenly torn. What did he want more? To confirm his son could speak again, or to find whomever he was speaking to? The creak of the door hinge settled the matter for him. He ran to the closet and threw it open. There was nothing inside, or at the least, nothing that shouldn't be there. He swept aside the clothes on their hangers, but nothing was hiding between them. He then dragged the toy box out and emptied it onto the floor. Nothing. He combed along the bare walls and floor, and, yes, the ceiling, pushing aside every last bit of rubbish and stray knickknack, so he could be sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was hiding. All the while, Daniel watched him. After a few minutes, James was panting and covered in sweat. The closet was bare, and there were neither intruders nor answers inside. It struck him as funny, somehow. He started to laugh, very quietly. He kicked his son's toys out of the way and went to sit down on the bed, dazed. He became aware, all at once, of several things. The first being that he had not slept in days. It was nowhere near in his right mind. The second was how close he had come to really losing it for good. Tomorrow, he decided, they would both sleep until the afternoon, and when they did wake up, he and Daniel would get out of this creaky old house. No more staying cooped up like prisoners, and no more checkups, and no more dreams about monsters. He would even take the bars off the windows. It was time to get back to living like real people again. It was time to... James saw it when he brushed a hand through Daniel's hair. He pulled Daniel closer, a bit too roughly. His son acquiesced to the examination without fidgeting or complaint, as James pawed the side of his head, hoping that what he was seeing would somehow stop being apparent. He stared and stared until he ached from not blinking, but there was no denying what was right in front of his eyes. Daniel was missing an ear. No, he realized with mounting nausea, both ears. There was no injury, no incision, no mark where they should have been. Simply smooth, blank flesh, as blank as Daniel's quiet, unperturbed demeanor. James swept him up in his arms and ran to the hall. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he meant to do when he got there. He just knew that there was now nothing more important than getting his son out of that house. But their path was cut off. A naked man sat in the hallway with his back to them. No, not a man. James recognized its stretched limbs and stooped shoulders. The pale thing squatted on its haunches, rocking back and forth like it was palsied. It almost seemed to be in pain. James hugged his son closer and backed away. Then he heard Daniel's voice. "Daddy?" James turned and heard the voice again. "Daddy?" But Daniel's lips hadn't moved. James looked at the hunched figure. Its head jerked when it talked, like a tick.
"Hello, Daddy."
James' mouth went dry. It took several more tries before he could speak. "Don't call me that."
"It is this voice's name for you."
"Go away. Leave my family alone."
"But I am your family."
The more it spoke, the more the voice became distorted and blurred. An icy feeling nestled in James' stomach. "Who are you?"
"Someone who came to visit.
"Why here?"
You invited me."
James' heart thudded against the inside of his chest. Why?
I had something you wanted.
James licked his dry lips. You're lying. You don't have anything I want. I want you to leave. Leave and never come back.
Who is Daniel's mother?
James blinked. What?
Who is Daniel's mother?
What the hell kind of question is that?
How old is Daniel?
The thing's voice caused a pinching pain in the center of his forehead. Stop asking me these things.
When is Daniel's birthday?
I don't know.
What is his middle name?
Shut up.
What was his first word?
I said shut up. James wanted to tear the thing apart with his bare hands. Only the heaviness of Daniel in his arms kept him where he was.
You were alone. You wanted a son, so I made one for you.
James' hands began to shake. That doesn't make any sense. Made out of what?
Out of myself.
James' stomach turned over.
But now, I need those parts back.
Daniel picked at James' shoulder to get his attention. Something was strange about Daniel's face. Danny? Open your eyes. Daniel scrunched his eyes even tighter. Danny? Danny! Open your eyes! Open your eyes! Daniel shook his head, trying to refuse, but he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually his eyelids flicked up, and James saw the truth. Daniel's eyes were gone. For a second, he wanted to throw his son down so he could stop looking at those empty holes in his face. Daniel opened his mouth, as if to speak, but of course, he had no voice.
He is coming back to be a part of me again.
No, no, no! Give him back! Give him back!
I cannot. It has been too long. I warned you this would happen.
You're lying! You're a fucking liar! Give me back my son! Give him back!
I do not lie. I warned you. He could not exist forever. But you do not remember. You can only remember what I want you to. You forget all the times we have talked.
Daniel felt like a doll, or an empty bag. His hair was falling out, disappearing before it touched the ground. His hands vanished into his sleeves, and his feet rolled up inside his pants. James cradled the tiny, shapeless thing. Tears streamed down his face. Soon he held a pile of empty clothes, and then those two were gone. He looked around the house. Toys disappeared. Photos vanished from their frames. Daniel's little shoes were no longer by the door. James turned toward Daniel's room and confronted a wall where the door should be. He groped at the blank surface, fingertips scrambling. He hit his hands against the wall. The pain didn't feel real. Why are you doing this?
It was what you wanted, and I learned so much.
This is impossible. People will ask. People will wonder. The police, the hospitals, the people in the neighborhood.
They have already forgotten him. They only remembered what I wanted them to. Like you.
James pressed his hands to his aching skull. Will I at least remember him after this?
You can try, but your mind will fail you now that everything he was is a part of me again.
James sat on the floor, looking at the blank wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the thing creep toward him and even felt its wet hand on his shoulder, but he did not look at it. If I won't remember any of this, then why are you telling me?
Because a father should know.
And then James was alone. Abigail worried about James sometimes. When they met a year ago, he said he had never been married and he had never had kids. But there was a certain pained expression he assumed when he said that last part. Abigail knew that look. She had met parents who lost children before, and you learned to recognize it. And there were other things about him that worried her too. Sometimes she would find him staring at a particular spot on the wall, brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't seem to realize he was doing it. And of course, there was the insomnia and sleepwalking to consider as well. Yes, there was lots to worry about. But she loved him all the same. James still persisted he had never had kids, and neither did she. She had long wanted one, but it was impossible, and she was worried that James wouldn't stay with a woman who couldn't be a mother, though he constantly assured her that was not so. There were times, and more often of late, that Abigail imagined that she heard strange, scuttling noises in the house and saw impossible shapes in dark corners. When she thought she would do anything, absolutely anything, if it meant having a little daughter for her and James to raise. It was in those moments she became truly afraid, but she never knew why.
My son, to include everyone. I tuck you in warm within, keep you free from sin till the Sandman he comes. Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight. Exit light, it's a night. Take my hand, we're off to never, never land.